The train ticket fell out of Delia Graves's coat pocket and landed on the parlor floor of the Redmond ranch house, and the moment it hit the polished pine boards, time seemed to stop entirely. Louis Redmond stood 6 feet away, his broad back turned toward the fireplace, but he had seen it. He had seen the small, cream-colored rectangle slip from her coat when she'd reached up to hang it on the hook beside the door. He had seen the way her eyes had flashed down to the floor in sudden, breathless alarm. He had seen the way she had cast a quick, frightened glance at him, and then, convinced he was not looking, she had bent swiftly, snatched the ticket from the floor and pressed it deep into her skirt pocket. He did not turn around. He stood there with his jaw tight and his hands clasped behind his back, staring into the orange heart of the fire, and he pretended with every ounce of discipline he possessed that he had not seen a single thing. But the knowledge burned hotter than any fire. Denver. He had caught the words printed on the ticket in the brief second it had been visible. Denver, Colorado, departure, November 14, 1882. The date was 4 days away. 4 days. He exhaled slowly through his nose, kept his expression composed, and turned around to face her with the kind of steady, unhurried calm that had taken him 15 years of hard frontier living to build. Delia Graves stood near the door with her cheeks flushed from the cold outside, her dark hair escaping from its pins in the way it always did when the autumn wind found her. She was 24 years old, and she was the most startling woman he had ever encountered in his life, and she was apparently planning to vanish from his ranch and from his world in 4 days without saying a single word about it. "Supper's going to be ready in about an hour," Louis said, his voice perfectly even. "Rosalie has been working on that beef stew since noon." Delia's green eyes met his, and in them he saw a flash of something that looked very much like guilt. Then the flash was gone and she smiled at him, a careful, deliberate smile. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "I'll go help her." She moved toward the kitchen, and Louis watched her go, and the burning in his chest had nothing whatsoever to do with the fire. To understand why that little cream-colored ticket had the power to undo a man as composed as Louis Redmond, you had to go back 6 weeks to the afternoon. A buckboard wagon had rolled down the long dirt road that led to the Redmond spread in the New Mexico territory, carrying 3 people and a mountain of trouble. It was October, 1882, and Louis Redmond had been running the Crescent R Ranch alone for 2 years. Not entirely alone. He had his foreman, a weathered and dependable man named Cal Prout, and he had 6 ranch hands, and he had Rosalie, his cook and housekeeper, who was somewhere in her 50s and had opinions about everything. But he was alone in the way that mattered, which was to say he had no one in his home who belonged to him personally, no one who sat across the table from him at the end of a long day and made the house feel like something other than a large, empty, well-kept structure. His wife, Clara, had died of typhoid fever in the winter of 1880. She had been 31 years old, and she had been, by all accounts, a genuinely good woman, and Louis had mourned her honestly and steadily for the better part of 2 years, and he had come out the other side of that grief not destroyed but altered, the way a fence post is altered by years of wind and rain, still standing but marked by what it had endured. He had a daughter. Her name was Maddie, and she was 9 years old in October of 1882, and she was the central fact of his life. She had her mother's fair hair and his own dark eyes, and she was clever and stubborn and frequently exhausting, and he loved her with a fierceness that sometimes frightened him with its intensity. It was Maddie who had written the letter. This was the piece of the story that Louis Redmond still could not entirely decide how he felt about, even 6 weeks later. He had been in Tucson for 3 days dealing with a cattle contract dispute, and Maddie had apparently spent those 3 days composing, in her careful 9-year-old penmanship, a letter to the Graves domestic agency in Kansas City, inquiring about the possibility of hiring a housekeeper and tutor who might, in her words, help Papa stop looking so tired and lonely all the time. The letter had been written, sealed, stamped, and mailed before Louis had even saddled his horse for the return journey. He had found out about it when the reply arrived 2 weeks later. The reply had been written not by anyone at the agency, but by the owner's daughter, a Miss Delia Graves, who explained in clear, precise handwriting that the agency primarily placed women in domestic situations, that she had read Maddie's letter herself because her father was unwell, and she was managing the correspondence, and that she happened to be in a position of needing to relocate, and would be willing to come to New Mexico territory for a period of 3 months to serve as housekeeper and governess to Maddie Redmond, provided the terms were acceptable. Louis had read the letter twice, called his daughter into the study, and had what he privately considered to be one of the more remarkable conversations of his parenting life. Maddie had stood in front of his desk with her hands folded in front of her and her chin at that specific angle she used when she had decided she was going to hold her position no matter what, and she had explained, in her practical and somewhat unsettling way, that Rosalie was a magnificent cook, but not a teacher, that Louis himself was away from the ranch too often to supervise her lessons consistently, that she had been reading the same 3 books for 6 months because there was no one to bring her new ones, and that Papa had not laughed out loud since the summer. Louis had sat very still through all of this. Then he had said, "You wrote to a stranger." And Maddie had said, "She is a lady from a respectable agency. That is not the same as a stranger." And Louis had looked at his 9-year-old daughter for a long, measuring moment, and then he had written back to Miss Delia Graves and agreed to the arrangement. The buckboard that had arrived in October carried Delia Graves, her father Edmund Graves, who had come to see her settled, and Edmund's hired man, a laconic fellow named Hatch, who drove the wagon without saying more than 10 words during the entire journey from the train station in Santa Fe. Edmund Graves was 62, thin, and had the careful, deliberate movements of a man who was aware that his body was not entirely cooperating with his intentions. He was clearly unwell in the way that people are unwell when something fundamental is going wrong inside them, and he tried with considerable dignity to hide this fact, and he largely succeeded except from anyone who was paying attention. Delia had climbed down from the buckboard first, and Louis had watched her from the porch, and his first impression had been of someone who was simultaneously composed and deeply worried. She was medium height, dark-haired, with a direct gaze and a way of standing that suggested she had been managing difficult situations for some time and had gotten reasonably good at it. She wore a dark green traveling suit that had seen better days, and she carried herself in it like it was the finest garment in the territory. "Mr. Redmond," she had said, extending her gloved hand, "I am Delia Graves. This is my father, Edmund." "Welcome to the Crescent R," Louis had said. Edmund Graves had shaken his hand with a grip that tried to be firmer than his condition allowed, and he had said, "Fine spread, Mr. Redmond. My daughter is an exceptional woman. I want you to know that up front." "Papa," Delia had said, in the quiet, practiced tone of someone accustomed to managing a parent's enthusiasms. "I believe that to be relevant information," Edmund had said, entirely unabashed. Maddie had appeared at Louis's elbow at that precise moment, because Maddie had apparently been hiding behind the front door waiting for the precise right moment to materialize, and she had looked at Delia with enormous, assessing dark eyes. "Are you the lady from Kansas City?" Maddie had demanded. "I am," Delia had said, and she had crouched down so that she was at eye level with Maddie, which was a thing that Louis noticed adults rarely thought to do. "And you must be the young lady who wrote me such an interesting letter." "I wrote it myself," Maddie had said with dignity, "without help." "I know," Delia had said. "I could tell. It was honest and specific. I appreciated both of those things." Maddie had studied her for another few seconds and then said, "You have interesting eyes." "So do you," Delia had replied. And just like that, in the space of about 90 seconds, Maddie Redmond had made up her mind about Delia Graves, and Louis had filed that information away because his daughter was, in his experience, an unusually reliable judge of character. Edmund Graves had stayed 3 days. He and Louis had played chess on the porch in the evenings and talked about cattle prices and the railroad expansion and the general political situation in the territory. And Louis had found him to be a thoughtful and engaging man who was clearly frightened about something and working very hard not to show it. On the second evening, after Delia had gone inside to put Mattie to bed, Edmund had set down his chess piece and looked at Louis with the kind of direct, unguarded expression a man uses when he has decided to say the true thing. "She has given up a great deal to manage my affairs these past 2 years," Edmund had said. "The agency, the house, my care. She has not said so, but I believe she had a life she was planning before I became an inconvenience." "A man's illness is not an inconvenience," Louis had said carefully. "It is when it consumes the life of someone who could be living her own," Edmund had replied. He had picked up his chess piece again and moved it. "I brought her here because I think the distance will be good for her, and because I believe she needs somewhere safe to be while I make certain arrangements." Louis had waited. Edmund had not elaborated on the arrangements. He had left on the fourth morning, and Delia had watched the buckboard roll back down the road to Santa Fe with an expression on her face that was very controlled and very painful. And Louis had stood on the porch not too close to her and not too far away, and he had not said anything because there was nothing useful to say. And after the wagon had disappeared around the bend in the road, she had taken one long, steadying breath and turned back to the house. "I would like to start Miss Mattie's lessons after breakfast," she had said. "Fine," Louis had said, and that had been the beginning of it. The weeks that followed were among the strangest and most quietly compelling of Louis Redmond's adult life, and he spent a fair amount of time during those weeks trying to figure out exactly why that was. Delia Graves was not trying to charm him. This was, he came to realize, a significant part of the problem, because he had been charmed by women who were trying before, and he had found it manageable because he could see the effort and adjust for it. Delia was simply herself, which turned out to be considerably more difficult to guard against. She ran the household with the same calm efficiency with which she apparently ran everything else in her life. She established Mattie's lessons from 8 in the morning until noon, covering reading, arithmetic, geography, and to Mattie's enormous delight natural history, which Delia seemed to know a great deal about in a way that suggested she had done a substantial amount of independent reading on the subject. She reorganized the household accounts with a thoroughness that embarrassed Louis slightly, because it revealed several areas where he had been paying more than necessary for supplies. She read to Mattie in the evenings, and she played a competent, unfussy piano in the parlor when she thought no one was listening, and she argued with Rosalie about recipes in a way that was somehow entirely friendly, and that resulted in both women being very satisfied with themselves and the food getting measurably better. She was also, Louis discovered gradually, carrying something heavy. He was not a prying man by nature. The frontier had a long tradition of not asking too many questions about a person's past, and he respected that tradition in himself and in others. But he was observant, the way anyone becomes observant when they spend their days reading cattle and weather and land, and he noticed the letters she wrote, and the way she sometimes paused in the middle of a task and looked out the window with her brow drawn together, and the way she always seemed to be doing a calculation in her head that had nothing to do with the household accounts. He noticed, too, that she never talked about her own future beyond the 3-month arrangement. Other women in her position would have mentioned plans, possibilities, things they were looking forward to when they returned home. Delia spoke about Kansas City only when referring to something in the past, never to any anticipated return. He found this interesting. He also found her interesting in ways that he was becoming less and less successful at classifying as purely professional. It happened in pieces, which was perhaps why he did not notice it happening until it was already considerably advanced. It happened the afternoon he came in from the west pasture with a deep cut on his forearm from a barbed wire snag, and Delia had looked at the wound with the practical eye of someone who had cleaned wounds before, sent Rosalie for supplies, and cleaned and bandaged it herself with a steady hand and no excessive commentary, except to say when she was finished, "You should tell Cal Prout that the western fence line needs attention before winter." "I know," Louis had said. "I am mentioning it," she had said, "because you are a man who sometimes forgets to ask for help with things that are not immediately emergency level." He had looked at her for a second. "How long have you been observing that?" "Since approximately the third day," she had said, without apology. It happened the evening Mattie had a fever and Louis had sat up all night in the chair beside her bed, and Delia had appeared at 2 in the morning with coffee and a damp cloth and had sat in the other chair, and they had kept watch together in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was, instead, the kind of shared quiet that takes a long time to build with a person. By 4 in the morning the fever had broken and Mattie had slept easily, and Delia had looked at Louis across the bed with tired eyes and said, "She is very brave, your daughter." "She is," Louis had agreed. "She gets it from her mother." "Does she?" Delia had said, and there was something in her voice that was neither agreement nor disagreement, just a careful and somewhat searching question, and Louis had filed that away as well. It happened the Sunday afternoon when Louis had found her sitting on the fence rail near the old cottonwood tree at the east edge of the property, watching the horses in the paddock with her skirt tucked around her and a book open in her lap that she was not reading, and he had leaned against the fence beside her and said, "Anything troubling you?" She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "My father is dying." The directness of it had startled him, not the fact but the way she said it, without preamble or softening, as if she was testing the words to see how they sounded spoken plainly. "I know," Louis had said, because he had suspected it from the second day of Edmund Graves's visit, and there was no point in pretending otherwise with a woman who was this direct. She had looked at him then, quickly, as if his honesty had surprised her. "He is trying to put his affairs in order," she said. "The agency, the house. He has debts I did not know about. The agency may have to be sold." "I am sorry." She had looked back at the horses. "He has been writing to my cousin in Denver," she said. "He wants me to go there when things are concluded. He says Thomas and his wife have space and that it is not charity but family. He has been quite persuasive about it." "Do you want to go to Denver?" Louis asked. The question sat in the air between them for a long moment. "I don't know what I want," Delia said. "I have not had occasion to consider that question independently for some time." Louis had said nothing to that, because he understood it completely, having spent 2 years asking himself the same question and arriving at similar uncertainty. And sometimes the most honest thing you could offer another person was the acknowledgement that the question was a hard one. They had sat there as the afternoon light went golden over the paddock, and the horses moved slowly in the dust, and nothing particularly dramatic had happened, and yet Louis Redmond had ridden out to check the far pasture the next morning with the distinct and unsettling sense that something had shifted in him that was not going to shift back. The second week of November arrived, and with it the kind of cold that the New Mexico territory produces in autumn, sharp and clear, and carrying the smell of distant snow. The cottonwood leaves had gone gold and were falling in long drifts, and the mornings were so bright they were almost painful to look at, and Louis was increasingly aware of 2 things simultaneously: that he was running out of time, and that he did not know what to do about it. The 3-month arrangement had not yet reached its end, technically speaking. She had arrived in mid-October, which meant mid-January was the agreed endpoint. But he had begun to sense something in Delia that he had not sensed in the first weeks, a kind of restlessness, a sharpening of the quality he had first noticed as worry into something more like resolution. She was making a decision. He could feel it the way he could feel weather coming in before the sky showed any sign of it. And then the ticket had fallen out of her pocket, and the decision had a date on it, and the date was November 14th. Louis Redmond stood at the fireplace after Delia disappeared into the kitchen, and he breathed carefully and steadily, and he tried to put the situation in its correct proportions. She was not obligated to him. She had come for 3 months at an agreed wage, and she had honored her end of every aspect of the arrangement. She owed him nothing beyond what had been contracted, and a ticket to Denver purchased for her own reasons was entirely her own affair. He knew all of this was true. He also knew that he was going to miss her with a ferocity that was going to be genuinely difficult, and that Maddie was going to be devastated, and that the house was going to feel different in a way that had nothing to do with housekeeping or lessons, and everything to do with the specific weight and warmth of her presence in it. He turned away from the fire and went to find Cal Pruitt about the fence. Delia sat in the kitchen and helped Rosalie cut the vegetables for the stew and tried to keep her hands steady and her expression easy, which was harder than it sounded because her heart was doing something complicated and agitated in her chest. Had he seen it? She was almost certain he had not been looking, but there had been something in the particular quality of his stillness, the way he had not turned around immediately, that had made her uncertain. Louis Redmond was not a man who held very still casually. When he was still, it meant he was thinking, and she had learned in 6 weeks to read his stillness the way she imagined a sailor read water. She had bought the ticket in Santa Fe 2 weeks ago. On the afternoon, Louis had sent her into town with Cal Pruitt for household supplies. She had done it deliberately and practically, the way she tried to do everything, because her father's last letter had contained the news she had been dreading since the summer, which was that he had perhaps 6 to 8 weeks remaining, that the arrangements were as complete as he could make them, and that he wanted very much for her to go to Denver to her cousin Thomas when the time came, and not to stay alone in Kansas City. She was going to Denver because there was nowhere else to go. The agency was being sold to cover the debts. The house would follow. She had a cousin in Denver who had written with genuine warmth and a genuine invitation, and she had a ticket in her pocket, and she had a departure date, and none of this was a secret except the fact that she had bought the ticket already, which she had done because if she had not done something concrete and practical and committed, she was afraid she might simply stay. She was afraid she might simply stay, and that was the problem. Delia Graves had spent 2 years managing her father's declining health and business affairs, and setting aside the quiet details of the life she had been building before his illness had overtaken everything. She had set aside a man she had been corresponding with who had eventually, understandably, found someone else. She had set aside her own plans to expand the agency into a full placement service for educated women seeking respectable employment. She had set aside, in the most fundamental sense, the question of what she herself needed, and she had done this without resentment because Edmund Graves was her father and she loved him, and it was simply what you did. But she was 24 years old and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor, and she was frightened in a way that she had not admitted out loud to anyone, and she had arrived at the Crescent R Ranch in October carrying all of this and had found, entirely unexpectedly, that the place felt like a kind of rest. Not because it was easy. It was not easy. Managing a household, teaching a 9-year-old, navigating the complex social geography of a working ranch, doing all of this while writing letters to her father, and managing the anxiety of not knowing how much time remained. None of this was easy. But Louis Redmond's ranch felt safe in a way that she had not felt safe in a very long time, and Louis Redmond himself was a considerable part of why. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a practical, weather-hardened man who wanted his daughter educated and his house managed, and who would be cordial in a businesslike way and otherwise leave her to her own devices. And he was all of those things, but he was also someone who asked real questions and listened to the answers, and remembered what she said and thought about things carefully before he spoke, and who treated her with a respect that she had not always encountered even in Kansas City, which was a good deal more civilized than the New Mexico territory by most measures. She was also not unaware of the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't noticing. There was nothing inappropriate in it. It was simply the look of a man paying careful, genuine attention, and it had been a while since anyone had paid her that kind of attention, and she had found herself doing the same thing in return, cataloging details about him that she had no professional reason to catalog. The way he handled Maddie, with a firmness that was never harsh and a tenderness that was never indulgent. The way he talked to Cal Prout and the ranch hands, as a boss who was also plainly a man who respected the work they did. The way he read in the evenings, with total absorption. The way he had sat up all night beside Maddie's bed without complaint or performance, simply because she was his daughter, and she was ill, and he was her father. She had told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that these observations were the natural result of living in close proximity to a person, and should not be assigned any greater significance than that. She had bought the train ticket to Denver because she needed the commitment to be real and visible and concrete, and because she was afraid that if she stayed past January she would not want to leave, and she could not build a life on the foundation of a 3-month arrangement that had simply extended itself through inertia and inconvenient feeling. She could not. She was absolutely certain that she could not. She chopped carrots with perhaps more force than necessary, and Rosalie gave her a sideways look that contained an entire volume of unsolicited opinion, and said nothing, which was, in Delia's estimation, the most suspicious thing Rosalie had done in 6 weeks. Supper that evening was exactly the kind of meal that made Delia understand why the Crescent R felt like home. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the stew that Rosalie had been tending all day, and Maddie appeared with her hair brushed and a fresh pinafore, and the expression of someone who had important information to share and was waiting for the strategic moment. The important information turned out to be that she had found a horned lizard in the rock garden that morning, and had named it Augustus, and intended to keep it. Louis said, with the patience of a man who had navigated many such proposals, that lizards were not domestic animals and Augustus would be happier in his natural environment. Maddie said that she had extensively researched the natural history of horned lizards. She cast a glance at Delia here that was both pleading and confident, and that they could be kept quite successfully provided one understood their requirements. Delia said, carefully, that while she had indeed discussed horned lizards during their natural history lessons and found them to be fascinating creatures, she had not specifically endorsed keeping one as a household pet. Maddie said, "But you did not say we should not." Delia looked at Louis over the top of Maddie's head, and Louis's mouth curved in a way that was not quite a smile but was very close to one, and something shifted in Delia's chest that she refused to examine. "We will discuss Augustus tomorrow," Louis said with finality. "That means no," Maddie told Delia in a loud whisper. "It means tomorrow," Louis said. They ate supper, and Rosalie had outdone herself with the stew, and there was cornbread and a small apple tart for after, and the conversation moved through Augustus, and the state of the West pasture fence and Maddie's declaration that she intended to read the entire history of ancient Rome before Christmas. And it was the kind of ordinary and pleasant domestic evening that Delia had been telling herself for 6 weeks not to mistake for something it was not. Afterward, with Maddie in bed and Rosalie retired to her room, Delia sat in the parlor with her mending, and Louis sat in the armchair across from her with a newspaper from Santa Fe that was 2 weeks old, because that was the nature of news in the territory, and the lamp cast a warm circle of light between them, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods. Louis set down the newspaper. Delia looked up. He said, "Your father wrote to you this week." It was not a question. She had received the letter on Wednesday, and she had read it in her room with the door closed, and she had been very composed about it afterward. "Yes," she said. "Is he worse?" She set down her mending. "He is not expected to see December," she said, which was the plainest and truest way to say it. Louis was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry, Delia." She had noticed that he had begun using her first name without ceremony somewhere around the 3rd week, and she had begun using his in return without discussing it, and it had simply happened the way things sometimes did when you stopped performing formality and started being honest. "He has had a good life," she said. "He built something. He loved my mother very much, and he was not the kind of man who wasted the time he had. I believe he is at peace with it. It is I who am—" She stopped. "Not at peace with it," Louis said. "I am not ready," she said. "Even though I have had 2 years to prepare, I am still not ready." "I don't think there is a version of ready for that," he said. "I have been through it, and I don't believe the preparation changes the moment itself." She looked at him. "Your parents—" "My father 6 years ago, my mother before that," he paused, "and Clara, though that was different, faster. There was no preparation at all." They had not talked about Clara directly before. Delia had been careful not to press the subject, because it was his and not hers, and because she had the distinct sense that Louis Redmond was a man who would come to things in his own time or not at all. "What was she like?" Delia asked, and then immediately felt she had overstepped. But Louis did not seem to feel she had overstepped. He considered the question with the gravity he gave to everything that mattered to him. "She was steady," he said. "That is the word I always come back to. In a life that had a great deal of uncertainty, she was steady. She was not a dramatic woman. She did not need a great deal from the world, and she gave a great deal to it very quietly without expecting notice. Maddie has her coloring, but her temperament is entirely her own. Clara was patient in a way that Maddie will never be." "Maddie is remarkable," Delia said. "She is," he agreed. "She is also, as I believe you have noticed, somewhat relentless." "The letter was remarkable," Delia said. "The one she wrote to the agency, the one that brought me here." Louis looked at her steadily. "She was right to write it," he said. The words sat in the air between them with a weight that was not ambiguous. Delia picked up her mending. She put it down again. "Louis," she said, "I want to be honest with you about something." He waited. "I have already arranged my departure," she said. "I have a ticket to Denver. I purchased it 2 weeks ago. I am leaving on the 14th. She watched him carefully for his reaction. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "The 14th of this month." "Yes," he nodded, just once. The muscle in his jaw moved slightly, which was the only visible sign of what he was feeling. "That is," he said, 9 days before the end of our arrangement. "I know I will repay the 9 days." "That is not what I meant," he said. Another silence. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. "Then what did you mean?" she asked. He looked at her with the direct, measured gaze that she had learned was what Louis Redmond looked like when he had decided to be completely honest about something. "I mean," he said, "that I had hoped you might consider a different arrangement." Her heart did something she had not given it permission to do. "What arrangement?" He stood up from the armchair, not pacing, just standing. The way he did when he needed to think, and sitting felt inadequate for the size of the thought. "I am not good at the kind of talking that this requires," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I have managed a ranch and a small human being for 2 years by being practical and straightforward, and most of what I need to say to you right now is neither of those things." "Try," she said. The word came out quieter than she intended. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "You came here as my employee, and I have tried to behave correctly with reference to that fact, and I think I have. But the truth is that somewhere in the last 6 weeks I have stopped thinking of you as my employee and started thinking of you as." He stopped. "As," she said, "as someone I do not want to lose," he said plainly. "As someone who has made this house feel like something I had forgotten it could feel like. As someone whose company I find myself looking for when she is not in the room." He paused. "As someone I would very much like to ask to stay." Delia stood up. She did not know she was going to do it until she had done it, and now she was standing across the parlor from him and the lamp was between them. "My father is dying," she said. "My home is being sold. I have a cousin in Denver who is expecting me and who has been very kind. I do not have a reason to stay." "I am asking you to consider that you might," he said. "What does that mean, Louis, practically speaking? What are you asking me?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him making the decision, saw the precise moment he chose honesty over safety. I am asking you if you would consider staying on not as my housekeeper or Maddie's governess, but as something more permanent than that. If you would consider whether what you feel when you are in this house is something that might grow into the kind of permanence that we have not discussed because I was trying to behave correctly and you were trying to leave. I was not trying to leave, she said before she could stop herself. I was trying to make myself leave. Those are very different things. The silence that followed that admission was so complete that she could hear the fire breathing. Louis crossed the distance between them in 3 quiet steps. He was not a reckless man and he did not do this rashly, but he did it with a deliberateness that made it absolutely clear. He took her hands. His were rough from wire and leather and years of outdoor work and warm and very steady. "Then do not leave," he said. She looked up at him. "I have nowhere," she said. "That is the honest truth of it. I have no home, no income past our arrangement, no future that is currently visible to me. I cannot stay because the feeling is convenient." "That is not a good foundation." "I know that," he said. "I am not asking you to stay because it is convenient. I am asking you because—" He stopped again, and she saw something in his face that she recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror. The expression of a person who is about to say something real and frightening. "Because I have been paying attention to you for 6 weeks, and I believe you are the most honest and capable and complicated person I have encountered in a very long time. And because Maddie adores you. And because when I sat up all night beside her bed and you brought coffee and sat with me without saying anything unnecessary, I thought that was possibly the kindest thing anyone had done for me since Clara died, and I would be a fool not to at least say it plainly." Delia looked at their joined hands. She thought about the train ticket in her pocket. Denver. Departure. November 14th. She thought about Thomas and his wife in Denver, who were kind people in a city she had never lived in, where she would build something small and manageable and safe, and she would be perfectly fine, and eventually perfectly content, probably. She thought about Augustus the horned lizard, sitting in the rock garden outside, entirely unconcerned with her decision. She thought about Louis Redmond sitting beside his daughter at 2 in the morning, with a quiet, complete devotion that had no audience and needed none. "My father," she said. "When I need to go to Kansas City, I need to be there." "Of course," he said immediately. "That is not in question. And after, he said, "I would like very much for you to come back." She looked at him for a long time. The lamplight caught the lines around his eyes, put there by years of sun and wind, and she knew now grief that he had carried without complaint. He was 37 years old, and he was a serious, careful, honest man. And she was 24 years old, and she was tired and frightened, and more than a little in love with him, which she had been trying not to be for approximately 4 weeks. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I am not an easy person to be attached to. I have opinions about everything, and I will argue with you about things you believe are settled. I am overly independent, and sometimes I forget to ask for help because I have had to be my own help for a very long time. And I will not give up who I am in exchange for someone's hearth and roof, even a very fine hearth and a very sturdy roof." "I know all of that," Louis said. "I have been paying attention." The corner of his mouth moved. "I am asking you anyway." Delia felt something release in her chest, something she had been holding clenched for so long she had forgotten what it felt like unclenched. "The ticket," she said. "I should have told you I had bought it." "I know about the ticket," he said. She stared at him. "You saw it." "It fell out of your coat when you came in this evening," he said. "I was standing right here." She felt the blood come into her face. "And you said nothing." "I was waiting," he said, "for you to tell me yourself. Because I thought, if you told me yourself, it meant you trusted me enough to be honest. And if you trusted me enough to be honest, perhaps there was something worth asking about." She shook her head slowly. "That is the most carefully strategic thing I have ever heard a man say while pretending to be artless." "I am not pretending to be artless," he said. "I am genuinely this careful about things that matter." She looked down at their hands again, and then she made the decision. It was not a panicked decision or an impulsive one. It was the decision of a woman who had spent 2 years managing other people's crises, and had arrived at a place where she was allowed to want something for herself, and had found that what she wanted was not a city she had never lived in but a ranch with cottonwood trees, and a 9-year-old with an encyclopedic knowledge of lizards and a man who pretended not to see things so that she could tell him herself. "I am going to Kansas City," she said. "For my father." "Yes. And when it is finished," she said, "I am going to come back here if the invitation stands." "It stands," he said without hesitation. "And we will see," she said, "what this is, properly and carefully and without either of us pretending we know yet exactly what it is." "That is reasonable," he said. "And you will have to talk to Maddie about the lizard," she said, "because she is going to be insufferable about it." Louis laughed. It was a full, genuine, unguarded laugh, the kind she did not think he deployed often, and it transformed his face entirely, and Delia looked at it and understood with perfect clarity that she was already considerably further into this than properly and carefully really covered. She went to Kansas City on November 14th, not to Denver, which she had written to Thomas and his wife about with apology and explanation and genuine gratitude for their kindness. She went on the same train the ticket had named, in the same direction as far as Albuquerque, and then north and east into the cold middle of the country. Edmund Graves died on November 26, 1882, at 5:30 in the morning, with Delia beside him. He went quietly, which was a thing he had arranged for himself by being a man who made peace with the people he loved before the end rather than after, and his face in death had the same expression of settled dignity with which he had faced everything that Delia could remember. She stayed in Kansas City for 3 weeks. There were arrangements and legalities and the difficult domestic work of closing down a life, and she did all of this with the practical thoroughness that was her nature, and she allowed herself to grieve properly and fully, which meant there were several evenings in the small room she was staying in where she simply sat and felt the full weight of it without trying to manage it into a more acceptable shape. She received 2 letters from New Mexico Territory during those 3 weeks. The first was from Maddie, written in her careful penmanship, which informed Delia that Augustus had been officially permitted to reside in a wooden box in the barn, because Papa had said the barn was not the house and therefore did not count, and that this was a victory, and also that Miss Rosalie had made the ginger biscuits recipe that Delia had taught her and they were excellent, and that the cottonwood tree had lost all its leaves, but the view from the east fence was still very beautiful in the morning, and that they were all well, and that they hoped she was not too sad and that they were thinking of her. The second was from Louis. It was shorter and more careful in its language than Maddie's, but it contained at its close, after the practical inquiries about her well-being and the straightforward expression of condolence for her loss, a single sentence that she read 3 times. The sentence was, "The ranch is quieter than it should be, and I find I am looking forward very much to the end of that." She wrote back to both letters. She had a train ticket for December 19th. She arrived at the Santa Fe station on a cold Tuesday afternoon in the middle of December, and Louis Redmond was there with the buckboard wagon, his hat pulled down against the wind and his coat collar turned up, and when he saw her step off the train he took off his hat, which she had learned was the gesture he used instead of effusive speech, and she felt something warm and complete move through her despite the fact that the temperature was approximately 28 degrees. He said, "How was the journey?" She said, "Long." He took her bags without ceremony and put them in the wagon and helped her up to the seat, and they drove back out of Santa Fe into the wide, cold, brilliant sky of the territory, and he told her about the cattle and the state of the fences, and a disagreement Cal Prout had had with a neighboring ranch's foreman about water access. And she told him about the sale of the agency and the final state of her father's affairs, and the look on Thomas's face in Denver when he'd received her letter explaining she was not coming after all, which had apparently been one of affectionate exasperation. They talked the entire drive home. She noticed when they turned up the long road to the Crescent R that she had thought of it as home without examining the word first, Maddie met them at the door and attached herself to Delia's waist with a force that suggested she had been suppressing the impulse for some time, and said, with her face pressed into Delia's coat, "I am very sorry about your papa. He was a nice man and he had good chess." "He did," Delia agreed, holding her tight. "Thank you for saying so." "Augustus is in the barn," Maddie said, peeling away from her with the speed of a child who has delivered the required emotional moment and is ready to move forward. "He has eaten 14 crickets since you left." "That is a very precise count," Delia said. "I have been keeping records," Maddie said. "For science." Life at the Crescent R resumed, but it was not the same life it had been before November. It was a life that had acknowledged, however carefully and properly and without rushing, what it was becoming, and this acknowledgement changed the texture of everything in ways that were both subtle and considerable. Louis treated her with the same respect he always had, but there was less performance of formality in it now and more simple and honest ease. The kind of ease that comes when two people have stopped pretending they do not know what they feel and started simply being honest about it. He sat beside her in the parlor in the evenings and told her things about the ranch's history and his own history that he had not volunteered before. The years he had spent cowboying for other men, before he had saved enough to buy his own land. The difficult first winter at the Crescent R when 2 bad blizzards had taken a significant portion of his cattle, and he had had to decide whether to quit or dig himself deeper into debt and push forward, the way he had decided. She told him things in return. She told him about the woman she had been before her father's illness, the plans she had had, the life she had been building. She told him about Thomas in Denver, who was a good man and meant well, and about why the prospect of going to live in his house had felt like the closing of a door. She told him about the man she had once corresponded with briefly, who had found someone else, and she did this without bitterness but with honesty, because he had told her things that required honesty in return. He asked her, one evening in late December when the first snow had dusted the pastures, whether she had loved the man she had corresponded with. She considered the question carefully. "I was willing to love him," she said. "I think that is different. I was in a position in my life where I was ready to build something with someone, and he was the person who was present. That is not nothing, but it is not the same as what she stopped." He looked at her. "It is not the same as what I feel now," she finished, which was more than she had intended to say, but it was true and she had committed to honesty. Louis reached across the space between them and took her hand, which he had done once before, on the night in the parlor when she had told him about the ticket. He did not do this casually or without intention. He held her hand with a steadiness that matched everything else about him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. "I want to ask you if you will marry me," he said. "Not because it is the practical solution to your circumstances, because it is not the only solution and you are not a person who needs to be rescued from her circumstances, but because I am very sure about you, and I have not been very sure about much in the last 2 years, and because this feels like something I should not let pass without saying clearly." Delia looked at him for a long time. She thought about the train ticket, about Denver, about all the versions of a life that had been possible and the one that was sitting in front of her right now, steady and honest and looking at her with the specific quality of attention that she had come to understand meant she was the most important thing in his view at this particular moment. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He did not say anything for a moment. Then, "Good. That is your response," she said. "I am relieved," he said, "deeply relieved. I am also trying to behave with appropriate composure." "You are not required to have composure right now," she said. He looked at her, and then he did something she had not seen him do before, which was to simply let his composure go entirely. And what was underneath it was a warmth and a gladness that was so genuine and unguarded that it made her breath catch. And he leaned forward and kissed her, which was careful and brief, and then not brief at all. And the snow fell outside over the New Mexico territory, and the fire burned in the hearth, and somewhere in the barn Augustus ate a cricket entirely unbothered by the significance of the evening. They told Maddie the next morning. Maddie listened to the announcement with an expression that suggested she had considered this possibility some time ago and arrived at a position on it which she was now prepared to share. "Will she live here permanently?" she asked. "Yes," Louis said. Maddie turned to Delia. "Will you still do my lessons?" "For as long as you need them," Delia said. "Will you be my mother?" Maddie said. The question was simple and direct, and absolutely devastating in the way that only a child who has lost their mother can make a simple question. Delia sat down so she was at Maddie's level, the same thing she had done the first day when she stepped off the buckboard, and she looked at her steadily. "I will not try to replace your mother," she said. "Clara Redmond was your mother and she always will be, and that is something nobody can change and nobody should try to. But I love you, Maddie, and I am going to be here. And if you want me to be your mother, I would be honored to be that in every way I am able." Maddie considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, "Can I tell Augustus?" Louis made a sound that was not entirely unlike the laugh he had produced in the parlor on the night they had discussed the train ticket. And Delia looked over Maddie's head at him with her eyes bright. And Maddie took both of their hands in her small ones and pulled them toward the door to the barn. They were married on February 8th, 1883, in the small church in the nearest town, which was a 3-hour drive from the ranch in the buckboard. The wedding was attended by Cal Prout and his wife, Rosalie, the 6 ranch hands, the preacher, and about a dozen other residents of the area who were drawn by curiosity and stayed for the cake, which Rosalie had produced at a level of magnificence that she considered appropriate to the occasion. Delia wore a dress that had been Clara's, which Louis had offered with careful respect, and which Delia had accepted with the same careful respect, because it fit her well, and because Clara Redmond had been a woman of good taste, and because wearing it felt like an acknowledgement of everything that had come before this moment rather than a denial of it. She had altered it herself, taken in the waist and let out the hem, and it was blue wool with cream trim, and in it she stood beside Louis Redmond and made promises that she intended to keep. Louis was visibly, quietly, unperformatively happy, which was the most moving thing she had ever seen from a man who was sparing with his expressions. Maddie was the flower girl and took the role with a seriousness that suggested she had been practicing. And when the preacher said the final words and Louis kissed his bride, Maddie stood beside them and looked pleased in the exact way she looked when an experiment had confirmed her hypothesis. The spring came early to New Mexico territory in 1883, and with it came all the work of a working ranch renewing itself after winter, and Delia threw herself into it with the same complete attention she gave to everything. She rode out with Louis to check the fence lines, learned to identify the cattle by their markings, sat up late with the ranch account books, and identified 3 areas where they could reduce expenditure without reducing quality, and argued cheerfully with Cal Prout about the best way to rotate the pastures. Cal Prout, who had been initially cautious about the changes in the Redmond household, came around to his opinion of Delia Graves' Redmond somewhere around April. Specifically on the afternoon, she climbed a fence post to retrieve a calf that had gotten itself tangled in a wire gap without waiting for anyone to come help her, and came back to the barn with the calf under one arm and her hair entirely out of its pins and her boots muddy to the knee, and told Cal what she had found about the condition of the wire along the southeast boundary in the same calm, detailed way she told Louis everything. Cal had come to Louis that evening and said, "Your wife is a considerable woman, Mr. Redmond." Louis had said, "I know that." And Cal had said, "I wanted to make sure you knew I knew it too," and had gone to tend his horse, and Louis had found Delia in the kitchen and told her, and she had looked pleased in a way that was completely unaffected. The summer was long and bright and good. Maddie's education continued with a rigor and delight that made Louis proud, and Augustus thrived in the barn at a rate that Maddie documented with scientific precision. and the Crescent R produced a cattle season that was the best in 3 years. And at night, Louis and Delia sat on the porch in the warm dark and talked about everything, and nothing in the comfortable and honest way of two people who have decided to share their whole lives. In the quiet hour before dawn one September morning, Delia told Louis she was expecting a child. He went very still for a moment, and she watched his face carefully because she had learned to read his stillness, and what she saw in it was a gladness so complete it was almost solemn. He took her face in his hands and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am told the mornings are difficult for a time, and they are, but otherwise I am entirely well." "You should tell me if that changes," he said. "I will tell you if it changes," she said. "You will not try to manage it by yourself without telling me." "I will try," she said, "but I will also probably tell you." He kissed her forehead with a gentleness that was so careful it made her close her eyes. "I am very glad," he said, into her hair. "So am I," she said, and found that she meant it without reservation. They told Maddie, who had already suspected, because Maddie suspected most things before she was told them, and who responded by immediately beginning to compile a list of appropriate names organized by historical significance, which she presented to her parents at supper with the confidence of a person who has done thorough research. Louis looked at the list, which contained, in order, Marcus, Aurelius, Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Hadrian, and 7 others. "These are exclusively Roman and Egyptian," he observed. "I have been studying ancient history," Maddie said. "We appreciate the research," Delia said. "We will take it under consideration." Maddie looked satisfied with this. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was cold but manageable, and Delia moved through it with the practical adaptability she brought to all seasons, adjusting her work around her condition without stopping it. And Louis worried about her in the steady, contained way that was his nature, and Rosalie produced an entire regiment of strengthening soups and broths, and watched over Delia with an authority that Delia found more endearing than she expected. Thomas and his wife came from Denver at Christmas. They stayed a week, and Thomas spent considerable time talking with Louis about cattle futures and railroad development, and his wife spent considerable time in long and animated conversation with Delia that ranged across everything from family history to domestic arrangements to the state of women's education in the territory. And on the last evening, Thomas said to Louis, with the directness of a man who had known Delia since she was a child, "I was worried when she didn't come to Denver. I thought she was making a mistake driven by feeling." "And now," Louis said. Thomas looked across the parlor to where Delia was laughing at something his wife had said, and she was 7 months along and her face was open and entirely at ease, and Thomas said, "And now I think she was the smartest person in the room, which has always been true, but it is good to be confirmed in it." Louis smiled, small and genuine. "Yes," he said, "she usually is." The baby arrived on a Tuesday in late February, 1884, into the very capable hands of the doctor Louis had brought from Santa Fe 2 weeks before the expected date, because he was not a man who left these things to chance. The birth was not easy, and there were several hours in which Louis Redmond, who had faced storms and financial ruin and personal grief with considerable composure, sat outside the bedroom door and was unable to be composed about anything at all. Rosalie brought him coffee and told him that Delia was strong and the doctor was good, and that he should drink the coffee, and he held the cup and did not drink it. When the door finally opened and the doctor came out and told him that everything was well, Louis stood up so quickly he knocked the coffee off the small table and did not notice. He went into the room, and Delia was pale and exhausted and entirely herself, and she looked up at him and said, "We have a son." He sat beside her on the bed and looked at the small red-faced creature that Rosalie was placing in Delia's arms, and he was aware of something happening inside his chest that was too large and too various to name all at once, and he put his arm around Delia and held her and the child together and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. "He needs a name," Delia said after a time. He does, Louis agreed. Maddie's list was comprehensive, Delia said. It was, Louis agreed. I thought Edmund, Delia said. Edmund Louis Redmond. If you have no objection. He looked at her. Your father was a good man, he said. He was, she said. Edmund Louis Redmond, he said. That is a very solid name. He looks like a solid sort of person, Delia said, looking at their son. He did. He was red and squashed, as newborns are, but there was something in his face already that suggested a thorough and reliable character, which may have been projection but which turned out in the years that followed to be fairly accurate. Maddie was summoned from the kitchen where she had been waiting with Cal Prout and Rosalie and the ranch hands, who had all gathered in the way people gather at the edge of something significant, and she came in with enormous eyes and stood beside the bed and looked at her brother. He is very small, she said. He will get larger, Delia said. He looks like Papa around the eyes, Maddie said. He does, Louis agreed. Are we calling him Marcus? Maddie asked with careful hopefulness. We are calling him Edmund, Louis said. Maddie considered this. Edmund is also a solid historical name, she said. Edmund was a king of the Anglo-Saxons. I did not know that, Delia said. He was also a saint, Maddie said. I think it is a fine choice. She touched her brother's very small hand with one careful finger, and Edmund curled his fingers around hers in the automatic way of new babies. And Maddie looked up at her parents with an expression of such complete and open wonder that it made Louis's chest do the same large, various thing it had done when the doctor told him everyone was well. The years settled into themselves the way the best years do, with a quality of ordinary richness that does not look like anything remarkable when you are inside it, but which you understand the value of when you look back. Edmund grew from a solid baby into a determined, sunny-tempered toddler who followed Louis around the ranch with complete and uncritical devotion, and who learned the word cattle before he learned the word please, which said a great deal about his priorities. He had his mother's dark green eyes and his father's jaw and Maddie's intellectual curiosity, though his expressed itself primarily in the direction of things with mechanical or physical components, which meant by the time he was 3 he had taken apart 2 of the household's better oil lamps and had very clear ideas about the construction of fences. Maddie, at 11 and 12 and 13, became the person that Delia had seen the outlines of from the first day. Someone of ferocious intelligence and genuine warmth, and a complete inability to be less than entirely honest, which made her challenging in some situations and absolutely invaluable in others. She read everything she could obtain and wrote letters to scientific publications, and corresponded, through Delia's encouragement, with a female educator in Santa Fe, who ran a school for girls and who told Delia in a private letter that Maddie was the most extraordinary student she had encountered in 20 years. The conversation about Maddie's future was one that Louis and Delia had carefully and thoroughly over several evenings, sitting on the porch in the way they sat on the porch about everything important, and the conclusion they reached was that Maddie should go east for school when the time came, if she wanted to, and that she should never feel that the ranch required her to limit herself, and that whatever she became it should be because she had chosen it with full access to all the possibilities. Maddie, when this was conveyed to her, said, "I want to be a naturalist." Louis said, "Then you will be a naturalist." Maddie said, "It is not common for women." Delia said, "Most worthwhile things are not common until someone decides to do them anyway." Maddie looked at her stepmother with an expression that contained a great deal that she did not say aloud, and then she went to her room and wrote in her journal for an hour, and whatever she wrote in it she did not share, but something in her bearing from that evening forward had a quality of settled resolution that had not been there before. The ranch continued to grow and change. Louis bought the parcel of land to the east in the winter of 1885, which doubled the size of the Crescent R and required significant additional labor and investment, and Delia went through the projections and plans with him at the kitchen table over the course of 2 long evenings, and told him where she saw risk and where she saw opportunity, and her read on the situation turned out to be more accurate than his, which he freely acknowledged, and which she did not labor the point of. Because that was the kind of partnership they had built. Cal Pruitt's wife fell ill in the spring of 1885, and Cal missed several weeks of work, and Delia managed the ranch hand's schedules and the daily operations with a completeness that earned her a reputation in the surrounding ranching community as someone whose intelligence and competence were not to be underestimated, which was a reputation she had not sought but was not sorry to have. In the summer of 1886, Delia discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Louis immediately, without practicing the announcement first, because she had learned that telling him things immediately was always simpler and better than not, and because his reaction, the same steady and solemn gladness he had shown the first time, was worth having without delay. The second child was born in March of 1887, a girl this time, dark-haired and loud and entirely convinced from the first moments of her existence that she had opinions worth expressing. They named her Clara Rose, for Louis's first wife and for Delia's mother, and the naming was done without difficulty or complication, because both of them understood what it meant and what it honored, and neither of them felt threatened by the honoring. Mattie, at 14, looked at her sister with the expression of someone who has been presented with a very interesting new area of study. "She is very vocal," Mattie said. "She is," Delia agreed, in the particular tone of a woman who has been listening to vocal for approximately 16 hours. "I can take her for a while," Mattie said. "I have read about infant development and I believe I could be useful." She was, in fact, extraordinarily useful, and Clara Rose became Mattie's particular project in the same way Augustus the horned lizard had been, approached with scientific interest and genuine affection, and this turned out to be an excellent arrangement for everyone. Edmund, at 3, was initially uncertain about the addition of a person smaller and louder than himself, but was won over by the fact that Clara Rose, from a very early age, looked at him with an admiration he found appropriate. Louis Redmond, in the spring of 1887, stood on the porch of the Crescent R Ranch house in the early morning light and watched his wife walk toward the paddock with their 3-year-old son on her hip and their 2-week-old daughter, apparently asleep against her shoulder. And the light was the kind that the New Mexico territory produces in spring, clear and golden, and so broad it seemed to cover everything. And he thought about the evening in October 1882 when he had seen a train ticket fall out of a woman's coat pocket and had decided to pretend he hadn't. He thought about what would have happened if he had turned around. If he had said, matter-of-factly, "You dropped something," and handed it back to her, and the whole thing had proceeded in the ordinary way, and she had left in November for Denver as she had planned. He stood there with the spring light on him and found that he could not hold the alternative version in his mind for more than a moment before it dissolved, because it was simply not the version of the world that had any weight in it. Delia turned at the fence rail and saw him standing on the porch, and she raised her free hand in a small wave that was entirely casual and entirely warm, and he raised his in return, and Edmund on her hip looked at his father and said with great satisfaction, "Papa, cows." "Yes," Louis said across the distance, "cows." Cal Pruitt came around the side of the barn, and the morning work began, and the Crescent R moved into another day in the clear, unhurried way of a place that knows what it is and what it is for. There is a particular quality that belongs to a life that has been honestly built, which is different from a life that has been carefully arranged or strategically managed. A carefully arranged life has a kind of smooth surface that looks impressive from a distance, but does not provide much to hold on to when things get difficult. An honestly built life is rougher and more complicated and considerably less impressive from a distance, and it tends to have weight and warmth in all the places that matter most. Louis Redmond had spent 2 years after Clara's death building a life that was competent and functional, and deliberately not more than that, because he had not been ready for more than that, and he had been honest enough with himself to know it. Delia Graves had spent 2 years before the Crescent R building a life that was responsible and devoted and deliberately set aside, because her father had needed everything she had, and she had given it without resentment. And she had arrived in New Mexico territory carrying the exhaustion and the uncertainty of a woman who had been everything for everyone else, and did not yet know what she was going to be for herself. What had happened between them was not a rescue. She had not saved him from his grief, and he had not saved her from her circumstances. What had happened was considerably more ordinary and considerably more lasting than rescue, which was that two honest people had found each other in a place where honesty was the only currency that worked, and had built something real and imperfect and entirely their own. On a warm evening in August of 1888, when Edmund was 4 and Clara Rose was 18 months and Maddie was 15, and had already written 3 publishable observations about the lizard population of the New Mexico territory, Louis and Delia sat on the porch after supper in the late gold light. Edmund had been put to bed. Clara Rose had been somewhat less successfully put to bed and could be heard through the window expressing her opinions about this, though the volume was decreasing. Maddie was reading on the other end of the porch, her feet tucked under her, and a book about botanical taxonomy open on her knee. The evening was the color that evenings get in August in the territory, deep orange and purple, and the air smelled of dust and dried grass, and very faintly of the cedar that grew in the upper pastures. And Louis reached across and found Delia's hand the way he had begun to do in the evenings when the day's work was finished and the good quiet came. "I was thinking about something today," he said. "Tell me," she said. "About the evening you came back from town with the supplies in October of 1882, he said. "When you hung your coat on the hook." She turned to look at him. "The ticket fell out," she said. "Yes." "You pretended you hadn't seen it," she said. "I did," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the long August light. "What were you thinking in that moment? The moment you decided not to say anything?" He considered this with his usual care. "I was thinking," he said, "that if I said something it would become a different kind of conversation, a practical one, about arrangements and dates and contracted obligations. And I thought that was not the conversation we needed. I thought we needed the honest one. And you thought I would have the honest one. I thought you were constitutionally incapable of not having it," he said, "given enough time." She laughed quietly and fully, the way she laughed now, without holding any of it back. "You are not wrong," she said. "I am occasionally right about things," he said. On the porch, Maddie turned a page without looking up, though the corner of her mouth moved in a way that suggested she was listening. Clara Rose had gone quiet inside. The territory spread itself out in every direction under the last of the August light, wide and indifferent and stunning, and the Crescent R sat in the middle of it, solid and well-built and full of the ordinary specific life that made it home. Louis held his wife's hand in the warm dark, and Delia leaned her head against his shoulder the way she did at the end of days that had been full and good, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already present in the evening itself, in the particular warmth of the contact, in the sound of Maddie turning pages, in the whole unhurried fact of a life that had become. Through honesty and patience and a small cream-colored ticket falling out of a coat pocket at exactly the right moment, exactly what it was supposed to be. The stars came out over New Mexico, one by one and then all at once, the way stars do when the sky is finally dark enough to show them, and the Crescent R was quiet, and everyone in it was home.